Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we try to cut through the noise and give you that strategic insight you need straight from the source. Today, we're embarking on what I think is a really crucial mission, diving deep into the critical mid-stages of military planning. This isn't about setting the mission itself. This is where those conceptual ideas, the ways of a campaign, they get subjected to some really intense, rigorous scrutiny. They're pressure-tested, often refined. We're talking about the actual mechanisms commanders and their staffs use to try and anticipate the future and maybe mitigate failure before committing resources. It's serious stuff.
It absolutely is. And today we're focusing on two essential, really interlocked stages of the joint planning process. That's course of action analysis and course of action wargaming. These are really the steps that take those broad concepts and turn them into, executable actions. Make sure the plan can actually handle the friction, the messiness of reality.
Okay, and to guide us through this deep dive, we're relying exclusively on a powerful set of sources, three key ones. First, we've got the authoritative doctrine, Joint Publication 5.0, Joint Planning. This really sets the bedrock standards, for how joint forces tackle complex problems.
That's right. And second, we're going to connect that strategy to history. We've got excerpts from the planning documents for Operation Torch. It gives us a necessary glimpse, I think, into how these planning principles actually worked under real-world pressure.
Which is invaluable. And finally, we'll tie the operational details back up to the highest levels of strategic thought. We're using excerpts from the U.S. Army War College Guide to National Security Issues, Volume 2, National Security Policy and Strategy. That gives us the essential big picture, the ends, ways, and means context.
Right. And when we talk about course of action analysis, you really should think of it as this critical bridge. It takes the concept, the commander's initial vision, let's say, and it forces the staff to translate that high-level idea into practical synchronized execution plans. This stage is it's absolutely vital because it ensures the plan gets validated against two criteria that are non-negotiable, really. Criteria that sometimes get, maybe glossed over elsewhere. That the proposed course of action is both feasible and acceptable. If it fails, either one of those, it's not really a plan, is it? It's just a hope.
That distinction, feasible versus acceptable, that's where we need to start. Because, in civilian planning, if something is technically possible, if it's feasible, we usually just move forward, right? But military planning adds this whole other layer of acceptability, and that's based on risk, cost, consequences. Let's unpack that foundational analysis piece first. Okay, let's start with the formal definition then. Joint Publication 5.0 introduces course of action analysis as the, quote, initial rigorous examination of proposed friendly courses of action. But what does rigorous mean here? What are they actually doing?
Rigorous, yeah. In this context, it really means iterative. It's not just a checklist you go through once and you're done. The doctrine describes it as this constant cycle. It's designed to force the staff to reveal every detail, even the granular ones. They're evaluating the course of action's validity, identifying every single advantage, every disadvantage, and this is before the wargaming even starts. This rigorous use of staff time, it's mandatory because it validates that the course of action is genuinely executable, with the ways and means they actually have available. Think about it. If you find out a plan is impossible to resource after you've already started, the cost is just catastrophic.
Right. So the plan is built on the commander's approved operational approach, their visualization of how things should go. Yeah. But this analysis phase, it has to confirm that approach actually works in what? 3 dimensions: space, time, and resources. Let's go back to those core objectives you mentioned: feasibility and acceptability. How are they actually defined? How are they tested in practice?
Okay, so feasibility, that's the physical check, the tangible one. It basically asks, can we actually achieve the mission objectives with the forces we have, the supplies, the lift capacity, basing access, the timeline available? This involves some really deep dives into logistics. Planners have to evaluate, the requirements against existing contracts or potential contracts, task orders. They have to determine if contracted support can even meet the requirements. It's a pretty harsh assessment of the means side of that strategy framework we talked about.
That makes feasibility sound almost like a math problem. You either have the troops and the transport, or you don't. Pretty straightforward. But that second concept, acceptability, that must be much more subjective, right? Maybe even politically charged.
It is. It absolutely is, and that's precisely why it's so critical. Acceptability asks the harder questions. Are the costs justifiable? The risks? The diplomatic capital you might spend? What about the second-order effects? Are all those things justifiable given the strategic objective you're trying to achieve? This moves beyond just, can you win, and asks, should you win at this cost? Acceptability involves assessing the potential impact on, say, civilian environments, political fallout with multinational partners, the projected casualty estimates, the long-term commitment required. The analysis has to identify which course of action best accomplishes the mission, yes, but also best positions the force for future operations, often operations far beyond the immediate conflict zone.
Wow, that's a fascinating tension there. A course of action might be perfectly feasible, maybe you have overwhelming force, but it could be completely unacceptable if, say, the civilian environment gets shattered, or if a key political alliance collapses because of it.
Precisely. And this is exactly where synchronization comes in. It connects that high-level commander's visualization to the ground truth, the reality. The analysis forces the staff to identify the necessary sequencing of actions. Are they going to happen simultaneously? Sequentially. Some kind of combination. And crucially, that synchronization demands a really precise understanding of the resource constraints.
Let's talk a bit more about those constraints, because the doctrine makes it pretty clear that resources are not unlimited, right?
Okay.
Even for a major joint force.
That is the hard reality, yes. Force requirements for supported plans and supporting plans, they all draw from the same finite inventory of Department of Defense capabilities. And they're competing with other global needs happening at the exact same time. So during analysis, if one course of action needs, let's say, a particular type of surveillance aircraft or maybe a specialized medical unit available on day 3, well, the planners have to confirm that asset isn't already allocated somewhere else to a competing plan halfway across the globe. The sequencing of operations is just hugely affected by understanding exactly which resources become available and, critically, when they become available during the whole operation or campaign.
So the course of action analysis is kind of acting like a resource allocation referee then, making sure the theoretical ways of the campaign don't bankrupt the available means, and forcing a look ahead beyond just the immediate tactical win.
Okay.
So if they find a conflict here, or maybe a deficit, the course of action has to be revised before it even gets tested against an enemy.
It does, yes. It validates that the proposed plan is internally consistent before you apply the external pressure of the opposing force. If the analysis reveals some fatal flaw, say a 6-day delay in port availability for critical heavy equipment that you absolutely need, the staff must revise the timing, the sequencing, or maybe even recommend the commander adjust the whole operational approach. That foundation, that feasibility, it's essential before you can even think about moving to the next level of pressure testing. Wargaming.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So once the course of action, the COA, has passed that rigorous feasibility and acceptability check, we move to course of action wargaming. This is where they actually try to, predict the future flow of the conflict, play it out. What's the fundamental goal here? Is it more than just moving pieces on a map?
Oh, much more. The fundamental goal of wargaming is really proactive anticipation. It's the formal, structured process where the staff rigorously analyzes the probable effect, the effect each opposing course of action might have on the chances of success for each friendly course of action. And this is continuous, It's not a one-off. Joint Force commanders have to continually conduct wargaming, even during execution. They're looking for probable enemy reactions, adversary reactions to what the Joint Force is doing. They're looking for indicators of things they've forecasted, but also staying alert for the unexpected so they can exploit opportunities that might emerge.
It sounds incredibly dynamic, not static at all. And, modern conflict requires anticipation that goes way beyond just traditional battlefield maneuvering, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The doctrine seems to emphasize the scope has to be massive.
Absolutely. Yeah, wargaming has to be thorough. It has to plan for the effects of operations, not just on the enemy force itself, but also on the broader adversary, on interagency partners, multinational partners, and critically, as you said, on the civilian environment. The staff has to analyze things like the political factors, military, economic, social, information, infrastructure, PMESI, the whole range of complex variables. Commanders should anticipate that impacting the civilian environment might be unavoidable, unfortunately, but they must actively seek ways to mitigate those undesirable effects.
How does a planning staff even begin to mitigate an undesirable effect on the civilian environment? When the operation itself is inherently going to be destabilizing.
Well, it requires projecting forward, thinking about the second and third order effects. For instance, if a course of action relies on, say, destroying a major bridge to halt an enemy advance, the wargame must project the impact of that destruction. What does it do to local commerce? To medical supply routes? To internally displaced persons, maybe? Mitigation then means building counteractions into the plan itself. Things like maybe pre-positioning alternative ferries or setting up aid distribution points. Doing things to minimize that collateral damage and, importantly, maintain legitimacy. This level of detail helps ensure that acceptability criteria we talked about remains valid, even when you hit that inevitable friction.
This sounds like a system that could be ripe for institutional bias, though. If your planning staff has spent weeks, maybe months, investing all this intellectual capital into their friendly course of action, couldn't they subconsciously just test the favorable outcomes, sort of stack the deck? This is where it gets really interesting, I think, because you absolutely need some kind of independent force to challenge that internal confirmation bias, right?
That is the essential function, yes, of the Red Team. The Red Team is specifically an organizational element. It's comprised of members who provide an independent capability to fully explore alternatives in plans and operations. They deliberately approach the problem from the perspective of the adversaries or the civilian environment, other actors. They ensure the planning staff doesn't, well, fall in love with its own plan, as they say.
And why does the doctrine specifically state the Red Team has its greatest impact on planning during this course of action analysis and wargaming step? Why then?
It's because this is the stage where the plan is still, relatively speaking, fluid enough. It can be fundamentally changed without completely derailing the entire planning process. Earlier on, say during mission analysis, the Red Team challenges assumptions, which is important. But here, during wargaming, they are actively trying to defeat the friendly forces plan. They challenge the core assumptions, the preconceptions. They propose alternative views of the operating environment. And they rigorously test how effective the friendly course of action is against plausible enemy responses, even unconventional ones. They really complement the traditional intelligence efforts by critically reviewing intel products and sometimes even contributing informed speculation when reliable information is just lacking.
So the Red Team is basically forcing the planners to truly reckon with risk. And risk, as we know, is unavoidable, especially since planning often requires relying on assumptions, right? Those suppositions you take as true because you don't have proof yet.
That reliance on assumptions is, well, it's a necessary evil in planning. You have to use them to fill information gaps. But every single assumption you make incurs risk. So the wargaming process demands that planners don't just identify the assumptions they used. They also have to define the collection requirements. What intelligence do we need to verify those assumptions during the actual operation?
And what happens if the intelligence starts coming in and it indicates, uh-oh, an assumption is about to fail, or already has?
That is probably the most critical part of the risk assessment piece. Planners must assess the impact beforehand. What happens if those key assumptions prove invalid during the operation? For example, if your entire deployment hinges on the political assumption that a key ally will grant overflight permissions by, say, day 2, and the wargame reveals that ally is actually highly likely to delay that permission, well, the whole course of action is jeopardized, isn't it? The staff must have identified those information requirements tied to the assumption, so the commander gets warned before that critical assumption is invalidated. That gives them time, hopefully, to implement a contingency plan.
And the doctrine gives a pretty stark warning here, doesn't it? Almost a prohibition against wishful thinking.
Absolutely. The doctrine states, quite emphatically, that commanders and staff should never underestimate adversary capabilities. And just as importantly, never assume unrealistic friendly capabilities will magically be available. Assumptions have to be logical, they have to be realistic, and they must be truly essential for planning to continue. Wargaming has to pressure test those suppositions ruthlessly. You have to make sure you don't overlook a likely hostile course of action, or maybe a friendly inability to actually execute or sustain the plan, because either of those could cause the entire effort to fail. That's the difference, really, between a real plan and just a fantasy.
Wow. This whole process, then, the anticipation, the Red Team skepticism, this rigorous risk assessment, it really seems designed to push the planning staff almost to its breaking point, to ensure the plan that finally emerges is truly hardened against reality. Okay, so once the wargaming process is complete, the courses of action have been theoretically defeated, refined, tested again. What are the tangible outputs? What are the actionable things the staff provides to the commander? Well, the primary output is first refining the plan itself, but also establishing the framework for command and control during execution. This really means identifying those critical junctures where command intervention might be needed. And that leads directly to identifying decision points. Now, a decision point isn't just any old decision. It's specifically the latest point in space and time when a commander can make a key decision concerning a specific course of action and still allow the force to react effectively. Right, the emphasis on latest seems really key there. It's not just what the decision is, but determining that precise operational timeline that still gives the commander actual freedom of action, not deciding too late.
Precisely. The staff has to account for the time delay. The delay between the moment the commander initiates the decision, the thinking, the deliberation, the communication phase, and the decision point itself. That window, that's the available decision time. If the commander initiates the decision too early, well, it might telegraph operations to the enemy or maybe prompt premature friendly actions. But if they initiate it too late, the opportunity to effectively transition maybe to a better course of action is just lost, gone.
And these decision points you mentioned, they're directly linked to intelligence requirements through the commander's critical information requirements, or CCIRs. What does that mean in practical terms? How does that link work?
So the commander's critical information requirements, they support the commander's future decision needs and also their assessment efforts later on. They are essentially the critical information elements the commander needs that, if satisfied, answer a specific vital question about the operational environment or the threat. They generally fall into two main categories. You have priority intelligence requirements, or PIRs, those focus on the threat and the environment. And then you have friendly force information requirements, FFIRs, they focus on the status of your own major forces and supporting capabilities. They're designed really to act like triggers, to signal when certain conditions are met or maybe when conditions dangerously change, which then enables the commander to make the decision at that pre-identified decision point.
Okay, so we've analyzed the potential courses of action, we've wargamed them, now we move to joint planning process step 5, course of action comparison. The staff now has multiple options, presumably all refined, all vetted. How do they methodically select the best one? It can't just be gut feeling.
No, definitely not gut feeling. The comparison uses those rigorous evaluation criteria that were actually developed way back during mission analysis. The goal here is to objectively identify the strengths, the weaknesses, the advantages and disadvantages of each course of action relative to the others. It's a comparative process, evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of one COA against criteria like, say, risk or time or logistics. That facilitates comparing its net benefits against another COA.
And the doctrine, Joint Publication 5.0, specifically Appendix E, I think, outlines several pretty systematic, structured ways to do this comparison. It seems to go way beyond just a simple narrative summary. Let's maybe break down some of these comparison mechanics for the listener.
Yeah, this is where the process becomes a really formalized analytical tool. One of the most common and probably most robust techniques is the weighted numerical comparison. This technique allows the staff to actually incorporate the commander's priorities. They do this by assigning different degrees of importance, or weights, to the evaluation criteria they developed earlier.
Could you maybe walk us through a quick hypothetical example, just to see how that scoring actually works in practice?
Sure, certainly. Let's imagine we're comparing 3 courses of action. Let's call them A, B, and C. And we're comparing them against 3 key criteria, let's say. Flexibility, casualty estimate, and speed of objective attainment. Now, based on the commander's guidance, the staff assigns weights to these criteria. And let's say they have to total 100 points, or 100%. Maybe the commander values flexibility the highest. Let's give that a weight of 40%. Casualty estimate is next most important, maybe 35%. And speed is important, but last at 25%.
Okay, so flexibility carries the most weight in this example, 40%.
Exactly. Then the staff scores each course of action, A, B, and C, against each of those criteria. Maybe on a simple scale, like 1 to 10, where 10 is best. So for course of action A, let's say it's highly flexible, so it gets a score of 9. It has an average casualty estimate, maybe a score of 6, but it's pretty fast, say a score of 8. To get the weighted score, you just multiply the score by the weight for each criterion and add them up.
Okay, let me try that. So course action A would score 9 times 40 plus 6 times 35 plus 8 times 25. That's 360 plus 210 plus 200, which totals 770. Out of a possible 1,000, right?
Precisely. 770. Now let's imagine course of action B. Maybe it's less flexible, gets a score of 5, but it has a very low expected casualty estimate, so it gets a perfect score of 10 there, but it's quite slow, maybe a score of 4 for speed. Its score would be 5 times 40 plus 10 times 35 plus 4 times 25, which is 200 plus 350 plus 100 for a total of 650.
Oh, okay. So even though course of action B was way better on casualties, which had a high weight, its lower scores on flexibility and speed, the other weighted criteria dragged its final score down below course of action A's 770. That really clearly shows how the commander's initial priorities directly shape the final recommendation through the math.
It systematizes that prioritization, exactly.
Hmm.
Now, beyond this kind of numerical analysis, the staff also uses things like the course of action comparison matrix format. That's basically a standardized table. It's for recording more detailed evaluations, outlining specific strengths and weaknesses against maybe a wider range of criteria like force protection requirements, or how well it supports diplomatic efforts, or access to suitable medical facilities.
And what about simpler formats? For maybe a quick review by senior leaders who don't have time for all the spreadsheets.
Yeah, for that, they often use the plus minus neutral comparison example. It's quick, it's visually distinct, it just uses symbols. A plus if a COA performs significantly better than the others against a specific criterion. A minus sign if it performs worse. And a 0 or neutral 0 if it's pretty comparable. This format really quickly highlights the trade-offs. It might show, for instance, that course of action C offers really high flexibility plus, but probably incurs high casualties.
Yeah.
Makes the choices stark.
The outcome of this entire analytical sequence, the analysis, the wargaming, the comparison, it seems incredibly comprehensive. It's definitely far more than just someone saying, here's the plan I like.
Oh, absolutely. It results in several really vital products for the commander. You get the fully evaluated course of action, obviously. You get the specific recommended course of action. And critically, you get a detailed rationale explaining why that specific COA was selected. This whole package is then presented to the commander. And subsequently, it often gets briefed up the chain to senior policymakers, helping ensure the military effort is, fully integrated within the broader national or strategic policy decisions.
Let's zoom out now for a minute. Let's connect these really precise, detailed operational steps back to the high-level strategy. We mentioned the U.S. Army War College Guide to National Security Issues, Volume 2.
Yeah.
Strategy is often framed by that ends, ways, and means relationship, right? Where does course of action analysis and wargaming fit into that big picture paradigm?
Fundamentally, course of action analysis and wargaming are about validating that entire strategy framework. You're right, strategy is often described as the art and science of figuring out the future state you want the desired ends, then determining the approaches to get there, the ways, and identifying the resources you need, the means, and all of that has to be done while managing the associated risk.
So wargaming is essentially testing the integrity of the ways and the means, making sure they actually line up to achieve the ends.
Precisely. It tests whether the proposed military ways and the available means are actually sufficient to achieve the objectives, the ends, within what's considered an acceptable level of risk. If, after all that rigorous wargaming and comparison, the risk of failure, or maybe the risk of unacceptable second or third order effects, is determined to be unacceptable, well, then the strategy itself faces a crisis. It must be revised.
Wow. That sounds like a potentially powerful, maybe even difficult moment in the planning cycle. The staff essentially goes back and says, boss, the current strategy, as conceived, probably can't meet the objectives safely or effectively. What does revising the strategy actually entail then? What has to change?
It means a strategist, whether that's the commander or policymakers above them, has to adjust one or more of those fundamental variables. You either have to reduce the ambitiousness of the objectives, scale back the ends, or you have to fundamentally change the conceptual approach, find different ways. Or you need to secure or reallocate new resources, increase the means, or, more likely, some combination of those actions. Planning also forces the identification of methods to mitigate the risk that was exposed. Maybe things to reduce the likelihood of something bad happening, like through specific protective measures. Or ways to reduce the cost if it does happen, like placing a reserve force in a key area, ready to react rapidly to an event that the wargaming exposed as a vulnerability.
Okay. And this whole strategic testing process, it seems like it relies almost entirely on having a deep, accurate understanding of the enemy, doesn't it? Which takes us back to operational design, that concept of the center of gravity analysis.
Absolutely. The center of gravity construct is really the analytical linchpin here. It's an essential tool. It's used by commanders to analyze not only friendly sources of strength, but also adversary or enemy sources of strength. And just as importantly, their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The Joint Force Intelligence Analysts, they determine potential options for the threat's center of gravity by identifying what must be weakened, or maybe even destroyed, to defeat the enemy's whole approach.
It sounds like center of gravity analysis is so critical that if you get that wrong, could a mistake there nullify even the best wargamed plan? What are the dangers of a faulty analysis?
The consequences can be severe, yes. A faulty conclusion maybe resulting from a poor or just a hasty analysis of the center of gravity, can lead directly to the inability to achieve your objectives at an acceptable cost. For instance, maybe you misidentify a critical capability, something the enemy uses as their center of gravity, when the true center of gravity is actually the critical requirement that supports that capability, maybe the fuel supply or the command network. If you make that mistake, it means all your subsequent military action is aimed at the wrong target, essentially. That's why planners must continually analyze and refine their understanding of centers of gravity, because the enemy's actions, or even your own friendly force operations, can cause them to shift or reveal themselves more clearly over time. Understanding that relationship among centers of gravity just facilitates greater precision in thought and expression during operational design.
Let's look at a historical example, maybe, where the planning process explicitly demonstrated this kind of rigorous anticipation of vulnerability, and maybe the planning of alternative ways. You mentioned Operation Torch earlier, the Allied invasion of French North Africa in World War II. That seems like it could provide a great lesson in anticipating transitions.
It really does. The planning for Operation Torch, which happened back in 1942, was incredibly complex. The objective was to secure French Northwest Africa, primarily to create favorable conditions for launching offensive operations eastward against the Axis forces in North Africa. General Eisenhower's staff, they had to balance tricky diplomatic objectives with pressing military necessity. The immediate objective was absolutely critical, establishing a striking force in French Morocco that could seize control of the Straits of Gibraltar. Control of the straits was essential for controlling the sea lanes into the Mediterranean.
Right. And the course of action they initially developed for the ground campaign, it had an inherent vulnerability, didn't it? Something related to time and distance.
Yes, exactly. The initial approach involved landing forces in French Morocco and then advancing westward, overland, toward the border area with Spanish Morocco. General Eisenhower explicitly noted this in his communications back to the combined chiefs of staff. He said that the advance and the subsequent buildup of a striking force on the border of Spanish Morocco was, quote, necessarily time-consuming. This delay was a major vulnerability. It gave the Axis powers time to potentially react, or maybe time to stabilize the neutral but fragile Spanish position regarding control of the straits. That was a huge risk.
Okay, so this is doctrine in action, right? The course of action analysis identified a severe time constraint inherent in their preferred ways, the overland advance. And that led them to proactively mitigate that risk. They didn't just accept the slow approach and hope for the best.
They absolutely did not. Eisenhower proposed preparing an alternate plan, a plan for an earlier, more direct invasion of Spanish Morocco itself, if political circumstances changed or required more expeditious action to ensure control of the Straits of Gibraltar. This wasn't just a simple contingency plan like what if it rains. It was a fully developed transition plan, born directly from anticipating potential changes in the operational environment.
So the wargaming, or the analysis leading to it, identified that the main plan, while probably feasible under ideal conditions, was just too vulnerable to external shifts, specifically the risk of Spain changing sides or maybe a rapid German incursion. And therefore, they designed a structural alternative, a different way ready to go, so they could transition to a more aggressive, maybe riskier, but faster operational approach if the timeline suddenly compressed on them.
That's the perfect synthesis, yes. Transitions, in doctrine, apply to situations where the Joint Force Commander is contemplating a fundamental change, a change in the force's character of effort, maybe its posture, its composition, specifically to address an imminent or anticipated change to the operational environment. The Operation Torch planning really demonstrated that anticipating the need for an alternate plan or transition is just as critical as developing the main plan itself. It ensures the overall strategy can adapt and still achieve the ends, despite that unforeseen friction that always occurs. #tagoutro.
Wow. This deep dive has really shown us, I think, that military planning isn't just about drawing lines on maps. It's a systematic, highly structured process of critical thinking. It seems designed specifically to expose fragility and ultimately strengthen the strategy. We've seen how course of action analysis provides that necessary validity check, the feasibility check, ensuring the means truly match the ways to achieve the ends.
And then how wargaming provides that essential process of anticipation, exposing risk, showing the limitations of assumptions, with the red team acting as that vital organizational counterweight against, institutional biases or just wishful thinking. And those methodical comparison methods, whether it's the weighted numerical approach or the descriptive matrix or even that quick plus-minus format, they force decision makers to systematically weigh those refined risks and benefits against the commander's stated priorities.
Yeah, and the ultimate output of this really intense sequence analysis, wargaming, it's not just a document, is it? It's a set of robust decision tools. Those decision points in the commander's critical information requirements. They ensure the commander retains dynamic control, adaptability in what's always a complex and rapidly changing operational environment.
And that continuous adaptability, I think that's the key takeaway here. The future operational environment, it just demands moving beyond static linear planning. We can't rely on that anymore. Success increasingly requires the ability to know how to think about all these complex variables rather than just relying on knowing what to do based on some preset script from weeks ago. These detailed planning steps we've discussed, they provide the essential structure for that kind of critical thinking. They enable the necessary rapid, iterative assessment and adaptation based on actual results and continuous changes in the environment. That's the goal.
A truly detailed look at the real heart of strategic execution. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thank you. It was a great discussion.